on 40 East towards Little Rock, and a red car just flew past us, almost sideswiped us, made a U-turn on I-40. He was headed east, and he's now driving west on I-40. I'm at mile marker 21 right now.
August 7th, 2016. He's preparing to go out on patrol. He says goodnight to his wife. He anticipates long periods of boredom followed by occasional moments of tension. He did not anticipate that that would be his last night in his house for a while. He would not cross the threshold of his house again for another 3 or 4 months. After that, it was rehab. He didn't go back to work for a year. So, welcome.
I'm glad to be here. Everybody kind of knows the last call usually ends up being the worst. That's kind of how that night went. Got the last call while I was sitting in a Wendy's parking lot, actually. And that was the call of a car going the wrong way.
Okay. You get the call. Guys, wrong way, interstate speeds on a 2-lane interstate.
Right.
What's your first thought? What's your first impression?
So a lot of times you get that call and it quickly gets reversed. You hear, don't worry about it. He's figured out he was going wrong and he's turned around and heading the right direction now. So that's usually what you expect on a call like that. This one, we kept getting another call after another call, which means he's continuing towards where I'm at. And they were saying that he was about to run him off the road, and he was traveling pretty fast.
I believe I read that the initial estimates were he was doing 100 miles an hour.
Correct.
And I assume that's a 65 or 70 mile an hour zone.
Right. It's a 70 mile an hour interstate. It's Interstate 40.
Right. So you've had calls like this before, but they always resolve.
Usually resolved, or we get them stopped pretty quick.
Okay. You've got this call. It's coming at you. Are you moving towards it?
Yes. I got on the interstate pretty close to where I was sitting and started heading east on 40, and this guy was coming west in the eastbound lanes. So I started heading towards him. I turned my lights and my sirens on. It's pretty late, I see a semi and a car that I remember passing them because I was thinking this guy's got to be getting close. And so I got around those two and I began to try to slow down some. And my plan, is surely he'll see my lights and siren and slow down or stop. And I wanted to make sure that I was in the middle of the 2-lane. It's a 4-lane actually, but 2 lanes going east,
Right.
And so I rode right down the middle of the dotted line. And on the back of my police car, we have directional lights. And so I had a directional light on telling the people behind me to get off the interstate. So I'm slowing down, trying to slow down. As soon as I started slowing is when I saw his lights the first time.
And you're used to seeing lights at night on the interstate.
Sure.
But eventually they resolved to the other side of the meter.
Yes.
This
So
didn't happen.
no, I knew it was coming, and I saw him, and I'm hoping in my mind that he's going to slow down or go over, get away from us. There was a little dip in the interstate, so I saw the lights for a second, and then I couldn't see him anymore. And then the second time I saw him, we were right on top of each other. I was still in the middle, and he was in the left lane coming, would be on the fast lane, what people would call the fast lane. He makes a right turn or a left turn on his side. He'd make a left turn kind of from the inside lane going towards, and I turned with him, and then I remember turning back in the last seconds, and I knew we were going to end up hitting. I knew it was fixing to happen, and I don't remember. It knocked me out.
Now, did you steer into him intentionally?
So the way I've always described what happens during this is it's kind of like when you're in the middle of a play. Like I remember playing football in high school. Everything kind of becomes automatic. And the time that it took for us to see and then react was so fast that there's really no thought process through it. It was just a matter of, I'm going to be in this area trying to stop this vehicle. when we make a right, he rights with me, and then we both turn left, and then I don't remember what happened. Was I intentionally there to stop a vehicle? Yes. The thought process through it, like I said, it was automatic. There's no thinking. There was no time to even think about it. And then the actual collision, I'm knocked out until somebody comes knocking on my door.
This might be your end of life, not your end of
You're right. You're right. And the best way to explain that to anybody is any police officer during a lot of different scenarios. It could be taking the call of a domestic dispute, and a city police officer has to make that decision to walk up to that driveway and that door. And
yeah, well, in that case, you're increasing your danger.
Well, yeah, any of them.
Driving head on into somebody doing highway speed is near suicidal.
Well, like I said, it's a decision that you're going to be there in that chaos, and whatever happens is going to happen. Just as those other officers I'm telling you about, when they make their decision to enter danger, not knowing how bad it could be, even a simple call, turns out to be just tragic sometimes. And it's just because you're willing to be there. And the thought process is like I'm telling you, it becomes more of a autopilot deal where you're completely amped up and you're trying your best to make a good decision that's going to be the best decision for everybody. And sometimes that ends the way mine ends. Sometimes it ends with a death. Sometimes it ends with everybody going home happy. It's a risk that every one of us take. And I remember a lady just coming up and, she's knocking on the door going, "Sir, sir." And I woke up to that, hearing this lady. And wasn't sure where I was for a minute. I felt like I'd had a heck of a night's sleep. I didn't realize I was in my car. So I opened my eyes and I started seeing the chaos. There's fire around my car starting up. There's a
fire?
The front of my car is starting to catch on fire. There's, just destruction everywhere. Yeah. And I hear my radio and I go to try to reach for it. And it's off this side, and I'm starting to reach and I can feel just crunching in my body. And so I stopped, obviously, didn't want to hurt anything more. And that's when I started really realizing I might die, started to really come to grips with what's happened. I could remember then that I was in a crash. And I knew I started to remember a little bit of what had just happened. And so I felt like I was taking some of my last breaths. They weren't very deep. Later found out that I'd collapsed both of my lungs on top of everything else that was broken. And so I started thinking about that. And then we start hearing sirens. And I started thinking maybe I should just try to breathe a little bit, and just keep focusing on breath. So continue to just take some small breaths, and then I start seeing, what I tell people are my heroes now. They show up, the fire department and the EMS, and start working on everything to get me to a hospital. So,
at that point, did you have a sense of how they felt you were doing?
Yeah, every one of them will tell you that they didn't think it was going to be a good outcome for me. It wasn't looking good. The fire department was having a hard time getting me out of the car because we have cages in there and all those kind of things. They had a hard time. They've later trained now to make sure that they can get around those cages, because that's something they weren't experienced at. They never come across that problem. So yeah, I mean everybody wasn't real high on what was going to happen there. The fire department. So anyway, they had tried Jaws of Life. They had tried a lot of different tactics to get me out, and they just, every time the Jaws of Life would squeeze, it would crush my foot. So they get to a point where I can hear a man behind me, and he is just pushing a bar. That's what they'd come down to try to get me out. And he finally pushed hard enough and the whole car popped, and then I felt my foot come loose. And at that point, they were able to pull me out of the car. The EMS folks had already got my lungs back, and had got that working a little better. So things started looking better for me, I guess. Once they pulled me out of the car, that's about the last thing I remember.
What were the extent of your injuries? How many bullets did you get?
Oh, well, I'd say the major ones would be wrists, my femur broke in half, a lot of my toes broke, ankle, both ankles, foot, piece of my back, ribs. So quite a few different breaks and a lot of surgeries.
How many surgeries?
The ones I remember, there's probably about 3 or 4 that I remember. And there's, I'm sure, several that night that I was there, and maybe the first day or two that I wasn't really aware of what was going on.
Okay. Now, your total recovery took a year or maybe a little more.
It took, yes, sir. It took a good year of rehabs and staying at home. Started off still in the hospital, going to wound clinics. A lot of stretching at home by myself. The first several months at home were spent just in a chair. I couldn't really move. And then once it got to about a year, I'd realized, I felt like I was losing my purpose. That's a big part of my life is to be out there, trying to work and help and do what I can for the public in that job. That job's always just been a calling to me, and I felt like I had lost it there for a while. So I hated to be sitting at home, and I finally called my doctor and begged him, please, let me get back to work. And I came back as a CID agent, as an investigator.
So do you drive a marked car as an investigator?
I do now. So back then I was just an investigator. And I did that for about 4 years, and really enjoyed that time. And I promoted recently back on the Interstate as a sergeant. So now I'm back in the same place, doing the same old things, and not as much because I'm too busy doing all the paperwork. That's what the sergeant gets to do, but definitely getting to get out there and work with some guys that I've worked with before and spend some time back on the highway.
What do you think you learned about yourself through all this?
Well, there's a lot of things, I think anybody that's gone through a near-death type experience, you definitely appreciate life a little bit more than I think most people do. A lot of people spend time taking things for granted, and I don't. And I have a hard time saying no to anything. That's why we're here today. It's hard for me to say no. I always feel like there's purpose out there for you. I feel like in that car when I thought I was going to die, it wasn't quite as scary as I ever imagined death would have been. And I feel like that's because I was serving purpose at that moment. I feel like purpose kind of defeats death. As long as you're out here serving some form of purpose, I think death is easy. I think if you spend a long time of your life doing nothing, I feel like death's probably a pretty scary event. But if you're out here serving and you're out here doing what you should be doing in life, I think when that time comes, that you'll go easy.